Hello and welcome to K-Pod, the podcast about Korean Americans in arts and culture from Korean American Story. Today's episode is a special one. It's our final episode of season 2, and our guest is the comic book artist Jim Lee, the chief creative officer and publisher of DC Comics. Born in Seoul, Jim immigrated with his family to the States when he was 4.5 years old. He lived in Ohio before moving to St. Louis, Missouri, where he graduated from high school before attending Princeton. Jim's family expected him to follow his father's footsteps and attend medical school, but he scandalized them by becoming a comic book artist. Little did they know, Jim would turn out to be one of the most influential and revered figures in the world of comic books. Jim has drawn every major comic you can think of, from Superman to Batman to Wonder Woman, and holds the record for the best-selling comic of all time, X-Men #1. He was one of the founding members of Image Comics, and with his iconic work on Batman Hush in the early 2000s, achieved rock star status in the wider landscape of pop culture. As anyone who follows comic books will tell you, Jim is legendary not only for his incredible artistry and talent for telling stories, but also his expansion of the art form. We've also invited our very own audio engineer and Jim Lee superfan, AJ Valente, to join us in the discussion. Thank you, Jim, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Jim, can you tell us some of your memories of your early childhood in Korea? I don't know how much you might recall from those years.
Yeah. At this point, given my advanced age, I think they're memories of memories, right? I don't think I have any true original memories left, but there are a couple things that I definitely remember from growing up in Korea. One, I got run over by a truck in the streets of Seoul. So So it hit me and I went underneath and between the wheels. And I remember kind of waking up dimly in the emergency room. It's all kind of like this medical green color. So I have stitches on the back of my head from this and photos of me in the hospital, and the truck driver came and visited me and stuff like that.
Was your father a doctor at that point?
Yeah, he was a doctor. He was in the military. Right. So there are photos where my mom would take me to go see him, jump out of planes. He was a paratrooper. He was in the special forces as a doctor. But I do remember also, watching the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons in Korea. And then there was a Korean superhero called Hangubakchi, which was a skeleton with a cape. And I remember buying his candies and stuff like that. And jjajangmyeon is that black bean noodle dish, and they would deliver it in these, this is like pre-Postmates by, 50 years or so. But they would drop these off, like they'd have these steel, almost like
the
suitcases.
takeout containers.
Yeah, they bring them and then they would slide up one panel, and then there would be shelves inside the suitcase with the bowls of jjajangmyeon. So I do have some memories, and I remember when we flew over to America, this first time in a plane, and I couldn't eat any of the airline food. That I just had never eaten any Western food. So they gave me ramen, like a bag of dried ramen, and that's what I ate on the plane. So yeah, a lot of centered around food, definitely around superheroes very early on. But like I said, a lot of these memories are in black and white, and I think that's because of the photographs, right? So it's hard to, at this point, to say what's a real memory versus something that you kind of stitch together.
And can you tell us a little bit about your parents' immigration story? Did your dad come to do like a residency?
Yeah, so this was like 1969. My understanding is there was a shortage of physicians in the United States. I think maybe a lot of them had gone to Vietnam. But anyway, they were importing doctors from India, Korea, and my father did his residency in Warren, Ohio, a small town city near the Pennsylvania border. And we were a handful of immigrants that had come to Warren, and there was an article in the local paper, and I'm in the newspaper as one of 4 or 5 kids from other countries that were coming to set up roots in the United States. But, my parents, my mom and dad were really pioneers in that my mom spoke no English. My dad's English was not great. I can't imagine. I mean, it wasn't great later, but So I don't know exactly how it worked at the hospital, but he managed, I guess. But they were the first of our extended family to come over here. And then after he came over, his brothers and my mom's sisters and brother eventually all came, to the point where my entire extended family is now in the United States, except for my daughter, who's moved back to Korea and lives there. So she is one of my kids is the only member of my family that lives in Korea. Everyone else is here in the U.S.
It's the reverse migration because
and it was completely unplanned. I never spent a lot of time talking about Korean culture. I blame it on K-pop. That was something that she got into when she was a teenager. She really got into that. And then we moved up to LA, and in La Crescenta here, there's a pretty big Korean population. So they actually teach Korean in high school. So she took 2 years of Korean at the local high school, loved it, went to Korea, took an intensive language class, and it really enjoyed the culture there. And so she's basically, I think she's going to live there forever, to be honest.
Wow.
She's going to college there, taking her classes in Korean. Her Korean is light years above mine. So that's a real surprise. It was never anything I encouraged or, championed with any of my kids.
I bet your mom is astounded by that, right? Of all people,
absolutely. So my daughter will actually translate for my parents to talk to me now, because their English has deteriorated. My father's retired, and they don't use a lot of English anymore. So I'll say something very simple in English and they'll nod their heads, and then I'll question them. And then I realized they didn't understand what I said. They just kind of nodded their heads out of politeness. So she either translates or I text them, and that's how we communicate these days.
Your daughter learned Korean because she took the initiative. Was that not something, I guess since you don't speak it wasn't something that was taught at home or even as young children? Did they go to Korean school or anything like that earlier?
Yeah, I did take some Korean classes like every Sunday after church, right? That was like, they were trying to teach Korean. So I learned it phonetically, right? The language, you can, like the consonants and the vowels, pairing them together. So I can kind of roughly sound out words, and then I have to kind of say it quickly and with a Korean accent, and maybe I can understand it. And I can understand, like if you watch a Korean soap opera, or a newscast, or they speak very succinct, or they enunciate. And so I can understand that, but it's really hard for me to understand anyone else's Korean except for my parents, right?
Yeah.
And even then, it's almost always focused around, family, eating. You look too thin. Why aren't you eating more? So those kind of expressions I know really well. But no, you know what it is? I think they wanted me to assimilate. And even though there was a Korean community in Ohio and in St. Louis, and was active part of that church community, soccer tournaments, all that kind of thing, I really wanted to assimilate. I'll say honestly, it was tough growing up as this outsider, and it was something that I really was conflicted about when I was a kid. And looking back on it, I'm embarrassed that I was conflicted, of course. But it's just really, that was, kind of par for the course, right? In terms of how people were seen and open American society was to foreigners or immigrants, right? So it was very exotic, someone coming from Korea, and kimchi, like, what is that, crazy dish, and why does it smell so strongly, and all these things. So I didn't want to stand out. And so I didn't put any emphasis on really learning the language. And I think they were just happy that I was excelling in my academics at school. I think that was their primary concern. But look, I was a horrible Korean son. What can I say? I didn't become a doctor. They really wanted me to learn how to play a musical instrument. Never could do that. Didn't really learn Korean. I didn't marry a Korean woman. So in all respects, I don't think they really anticipated kind of the American culture really taking a hold of me, and just the need for self-determination or independence and all that kind of thing. It's just something I don't think they really had expected. So, but I think that's how I rebelled as a kid. I was a pretty well-behaved teenager, but I really was stubborn and defiant in my life choices, right? What I ultimately wanted to do as a career, who I wanted to be in a relationship with, the languages. So I speak some German and Italian, and my Italian and German are far superior to Korean. And look, let me just also say, they were completely right. I completely regret all these choices. I wish I had studied Korean, and I wish I were fluent today. And I wish actually I could play a musical instrument. And the only thing they did encourage was drawing. I drew in Seoul. I remember having an art teacher, and that's also another very strong memory, drawing a portrait of my father using oil pastels. And I remember that. And I unfortunately lost that drawing, but I remember it and how proud they were of that drawing that I did. But that's something they encouraged early on, that the artistry and drawing. But then later they were less happy about it because I was just drawing. It was kind of taking over my life. And even in school, I would draw on the margins of the tests and my notebooks and on the desktops everywhere. It was a out of control addiction in some ways.
We read that you were voted most likely to found your own comic book company when you graduated from high school. So you must have been the kid that drew all the time. Yeah,
but that prediction is not entirely, like, it's not an earnest one. Like, it was 25 years hence or whatever you see in your books. It had a prediction for every kid, and they were all warped and twisted, right? And so I think the actual prediction was that I would go to start like my own Zap Comics, and Zap was like underground, edgy comics. So it wasn't meant as like an actual prediction. It was like every prediction that year, was like, oh, he goes on to start his own Zap Comics or something like that. And I think it was probably meant in it's unlikely but possible, and wouldn't it be funny if kind of way. So if you look at everyone's prediction, they're not meant as serious predictions.
And you went to a private school, right?
I did. St. Louis Country Day School in St. Louis. Yeah.
Was that really preppy? What was that school like?
I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember. There was a book, the Preppy the handbook to the...
And memorized that book.
Yeah. So
Bermuda bags.
So there are a couple schools that are listed in that book, and my Country Day School is in that book. So that's how preppy it was. So I remember wearing like green polo shirts with the collars up. But it was a prep school, so you had to wear a coat and tie, but it was very common to wear coat and tie and shorts.
Like topsiders and bleachers and all of that. Yeah. So we had read that you did have a Korean American friend, Brandon Choi, who you knew in high school, and you went on to collaborate with him. So he didn't go to your high school, or did he go?
No, he went to a rival all-boys prep school. We knew their family through church. When we got together for church, you sit through the sermon, and I didn't really understand what they were saying because my Korean wasn't that good, and I just would follow the intonation, like the gravity of the way the pastor spoke. And then afterwards there would be like a Sunday school class where they taught that in English. But then after that, I remember like we'd like play cops and robbers or something, like for Christmas, like we got like handguns, right? And this is like unimaginable today, right? Like we've got like cap guns, right? Cap guns. And so all these kids are running around like trying to like playing cops and robbers, while they're doing their church thing. It was a very different type of church experience than I would imagine today. But that's kind of like my earliest memories of church. And so Brandon went to the same church as I did. And so after the sermons, we still had to wait for our parents to finish up with whatever they were doing. Church was like an all-day type event. And we'd sit in one of the rooms at the church, and a lot of times we'd just talk about comics, superheroes, and we'd start plotting our own stories on the chalkboards, and like who's going to fight who, and so I think those are like the earliest sort of collaborations I had with Brandon back in the day. And so we collected and read comics, we played Dungeons and Dragons together. That was about it. Really, like it was a pretty sheltered, quiet, suburban, middle-class upbringing.
So there weren't so many Koreans in your life, but it seems like you were drawn to each other. There was that connection.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, obviously, through the food and our families. And I think socially, my parents really, every now and then they might meet up with a non-Korean family but almost all the socializing that they did was within the Korean community. Mm-hmm. And Brandon, there were no other Korean kids exactly my age in any other school except for me and Brandon that I remember. Within this, prep school of whatever, league of 4 or 5 different schools.
We want to hear details about how you broke the news to your parents that you aren't going to medical school, because we all know that is the most traumatic news a Korean parent can hear.
Right.
Like hysteria, I'm sure. I mean, I can imagine,
Yeah.
They were doing so well. They got their firstborn child into an Ivy League pre-med, and they were so close.
Yeah. Right. I'm just glad there was no social media back then, or like TikTok or something, because I think I for sure would have expressed my, adolescent Sturm und Drang, the turmoil I was feeling on a daily basis with strangers online. But yeah, it was not just that moment, but throughout. I mean, I had a small, they didn't like me reading comics, but I would keep buying them, and they would buy them for me very reluctantly. They would throw them away in the trash. I'd have to go dumpster dive and kind of get them back into my closet. And so it wasn't like, it didn't come out of the blue. They knew that I was strongly interested in comics. But when I did tell them, it was a screaming match. It was bloodthirsty and it's, in the emotionality of it all. And ultimately
the guilt.
Yeah. So this was after I graduated college, and I ultimately had to say, look, I'm doing this, and if you don't support me, I'm leaving. And I left, and I walked out of the house. But we lived in the suburbs, and there's nothing for tens of miles. I don't know where I was walking to, but it would have taken me probably hours to get to a Greyhound. I had no money in the bank either, so it was an emotional walkout. But my father, to his credit, did come running after me, and he pulled me back in the house. And I think they realized how serious I was and how important this was to me. And they kind of quietly withdrew their objections and let me kind of pursue this pipe dream.
How much of it do you think is that they were worried about your financial insecurity, and how much of it do you think was social? I think Koreans of that generation, they're ashamed to tell their friends.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So big. Yeah. You hit it. So there's 3 components. I think one is the social piece of it, because they're so proud of their kids, and it's all about bragging to, they're doing this and they've achieved this, and saying he wants to draw manga check. He wants to draw comic books. Really, it was not something that was looked up on. It was not considered anything amazing. If anything, how did you fail as parents to let your son?
Right. It's not even real art. I'm sure that was considered the lowest of the, one of the worst things they could have heard. That or a rock band.
Exactly. But I also think they knew nothing about, they didn't even realize it was a job. And in fact, I didn't know it was a job, because who knew? There was no internet. I just assumed people could do this and make a living out of it. I had no basis in reality. So they didn't understand that it was a job and that you could get paid to do this. And I do remember them saying, you're just going to be a starving artist. You're not going to be able to feed yourself, much less, support your family. So they were concerned about my financial future as well. They didn't really know. And like I said, I didn't know either, but that didn't matter to me. When you're 20, 21 years old, you're not planning for a 401k. You're not thinking about your retirement. You're not thinking about how am I going to put my kids through college. You're just thinking about what do I want to do? What interests me? What's my passion? And that was very different than the way they were raised and the way they looked at life. They were an arranged marriage. 2 families got together and said, hey, my son and your daughter, would be a good match, right? I would be surprising them continually with my life choices, because we did not, there was nothing like that. I would just kind of come home and say, hey, I'm dating this person. And they'd be like, what? We told you, no dating in high school, wait till college. And then when I got to college, I was like, you know what? No dating in college, focus on your degree. You can date after you get out of college. So they had their plan, and I had a very different sort of path that I imagined.
For how long were they angry about this decision? Was it many years?
No. I think after that, big blowout argument. I mean, there was a lot of screaming and crying and just, it was like no holds barred, right? And then after my dad brought me back in the house, we had a civil conversation, and I think they just let me pursue this. And what that meant was I was in my bedroom probably 10 to 12 hours a day just drawing. I had set up a drawing table next to my bed. I'd roll out of bed, just start drawing. And I did that every day, like Saturday, Sunday, every single day. And so I think they could tell if I were a parent now, like, you know, I didn't notice because you're in your own world, but as a parent now, I'm sure they noticed the number of hours I was putting in and the commitment I had to it. And I think they're just kind of quietly watching. And, but once I got work, and not even a regular assignment, just like the first job that paid money, my mom was, you know, I got the phone call from Marvel Comics at the time. We were in our kitchen. She was so happy. And we basically held hands and we did like this weird, we twirled around. We were jumping up and down, like, you know, out of excitement. And so they never brought it up again. And it's not like I was making crazy money. I made like $21,000 my first year in comics.
They didn't keep asking you, when are you applying? When are you taking the MCAT?
Oh no, I took my MCATs. I subjected myself to taking the MCATs. So yeah, no, they never brought it up after that argument, really. And look, if I didn't break into comics within that year, I'd kind of personally set a 1-year deadline for myself, and maybe I'd shared that with them. Like maybe I don't remember if I said like, hey, I'll give me a year, and if I don't do it in a year, I'll go ahead and apply it. You know, I had all my transcripts, all my recommendations. I had everything ready to apply to medical school, right? From my professors, you know, I interned at a hospital. So I had, you know, letters of recommendation from all the right people. I had an MCAT score. That was always kind of the fallback plan. But I knew that I never wanted to do it. So
I am astounded that you were basically self-taught. You had you drew all the time in high school. You said you took a class senior year in college that brought you back to drawing. But just sitting in your room drawing 10 hours a day, I mean, people don't necessarily get better learning on their own. Before pre-internet, pre-YouTube, how did you teach yourself?
Yeah, you know, I would disagree that if you draw every day for 10 hours, you will get better. But the hard part is drawing 10 hours every day. And it was like, it's not like I just sat down and was able to draw 10 hours. Like it's like lifting weights or playing, like it's really hard on your body physically. And I remember like my knuckles swelling up and I'm pinching a nerve in my back, just physically sitting in a chair for that long and hunched over and using certain muscles and being in a certain kind of frozen position was really taxing on my body. But I would argue that if you do it every day for 10 hours, but you'd be amazed at how few people will sit down and do that, right? And so a lot of aspiring artists that I meet today will show me work, and then I'll ask them about how often they draw. And usually it's like, well, I drew this last night before I met you. And was the last time you drew before that? Well, the year before when I met you, you know? And so like, you're definitely not going to get better if you draw once a year, right? It's really finding that. So I really do think, look, there is a piece of it that you're born with, but the biggest piece of it to me is how hard you apply yourself. And I sound like my parents at this point. You know, it's like, to me, it's like 20% what you're born with, maybe 70% of what, you know, initiative and application, you know.
Oh yeah, that's a Korean belief.
Were you copying other comic books, or what were you doing?
I was drawing superheroes. Yeah, I was drawing all the. Like, I was drawing what interested me. I was not thoughtful. I was just drawing. I was just drawing what interested me. So, you know, if I had to draw backgrounds, I would. But it's not like I said, all right, today I'm going to learn how to draw backgrounds, or today I'm going to learn how to draw forearms, or, you know, a upshot on a face. It was just, I'm going to tell this story. I'm going to do it in 3 pages, and here I go. And I draw and learn what I needed to. And so every time I got to something, more often than not, it's stuff I had never drawn before. Because when you're a kid, you just draw the characters. But when you tell a story, you got to draw backgrounds. You got to learn how to draw vehicles. You got to learn perspective. You got to understand storytelling. So, you know, I went to the library and I checked out any book I could get on drawing or storytelling. And there were very few on storytelling or about comics. There was one book, How to Draw the Marvel Way. And then there's another book, Guide to Sequential Art, that Will Eisner, who's a very famous comic book writer, artist. I remember just devouring those, and then books by George Bridgman and Andrew Loomis, any drawing book just on human form and figure. So it was like an independent study. It's like, I've got a year, I'm going to do all my research, get everything I can get and pull it in, absorb it all, and then just like work and work and work. And that was the approach.
So what was it like trying to break into the comic book world as a Korean American?
That was one of the cool things about it, is I don't think it mattered what race or gender I was, although I think there definitely would have been a gender bias back then, in that predominantly the industry was male, 90% male, I'd say. And I think there was a bit of a stigma for female creators. It was more of a challenge for female creators to break in a weird, like, girls don't know how to do superhero comics, right? That kind of awful stereotype or prejudice. But in terms of race, I just think they cared about, like, I didn't have to send a photograph or fill out a resume or, answer any questions about, why I wanted to do it. They just wanted to see the work. And so I was mailing in my submissions. I was getting a lot of form letters, rejection letters back. And I was also going to a local comic book shop in St. Louis and just meeting some of the owners and people that were also trying to break into comics. And there was one guy that had broken into DC. And so he was the guy I would just pepper with questions, and I'm sure he saw as very annoying because, like, kid, you're not going to do it. Just looking back on it. But he did help me and gave me some useful tips. And the one that really stood out to me is like, hey, you can mail stuff in. That's not really the way to get in. Is you got to meet these people in person. And so I took that as the gospel truth, and I looked through a comic book, found a Comic-Con that was happening in New York City. And I assumed that editors would be there. And I flew out to New York. And some of my roommates from school were working on Wall Street. So I just crashed at their apartment and I went to the Comic-Con and I showed my portfolio to an editor at Marvel. He liked the work and he invited me to their offices on Monday. And that was a very nervous, anxious weekend or Sunday till that Monday. And in my head, I'm like going, they're going to ask me all these like questions, like, job interview questions. So I was like really trying to prep myself for it. And they didn't care. They didn't ask me anything. They just looked at the artwork again and said, like, this looks pretty good. Like, let's give you a tryout story to do. So at the end of the day, you just have to show that you can tell a story and your figure works good. And, they're very kind. Like, I don't know if I would have given myself work back then, but they saw something in it and they hired me to do the story. And again, because there were deadlines and you had to deliver, and now you're not just drawing the story that comes to your mind, but someone else's script and then having to bring that to life. I turned that tryout story in. They liked it. They paid me for that. And then they gave me a fill-in issue. I hit that deadline for that. And so, but if you look at my early work, every 3 issues or so, there was little bits of improvement in both my storytelling and my figure work, my ability to light properly and crosshatch, all that kind of stuff. And so I really feel like I was being paid to learn my craft for the first probably 3 years I was in the business. Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that respect.
Did you move to New York then?
No, but that was my final backup plan, is that if they wouldn't give me work, I would move to New York and try to get a job as like a janitor at Marvel, so I could like basically be in their presence, sweeping the floors and leaving my portfolios under people's, doors, locked doors, or leaving them on their desktops. So never came to that. But, it was a very mythical thing for me. Even as a young kid, my parents would drive around the country. My dad hated flying because of his time in the airborne. So we would take a station wagon and just drive everywhere from St. Louis. And we remember driving to New York City, and we're seeing all the sights. And my request was, can we drive by 387, I think it was Park Avenue South. That's where Marvel's offices were located. And then DC was at 666 Fifth Avenue. And it was like nighttime. And we're just driving by, and I'd look up the window and I'd try to figure out what floor they were on. And maybe you would see like a Spider-Man cutout or something in the window, and the lights are off, right? And then 666 is just a building with the red numbers on it, very ominous. But I never saw the offices, but I wanted to drive by and be close.
I can feel your youthful earnestness in that story.
Sure.
Just being by the address, seeing the building is enough. AJ, do you have some questions from the superfan perspective?
Yeah, I think it's great to hear that you had such a earnest to keep drawing and like for 10 hours a day, and I think years later, you probably had an impression on other fans as well. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, like, when did you realize that weight of these stories and characters had on readers and fans in general?
To be completely truthful, I collected comics because of the art, right? So my parents would give me maybe a quarter, a month. Like, I didn't get allowance, right? They can control you better if they don't give you an allowance where you can go and just do your own thing, right? Like, so if I want to go to the movies, I just have to ask my parents, like, can I go to the movies? Can you give me money to go to the movies, right? Can I go to this store and buy a comic book? They take us to the mall. I could buy one comic book. So I had like 500 comic books total, like as a kid growing up. And so each one was precious to me, and each one was like an example of someone's work. And so if there was a story and the artist who I loved drew that story, I would buy that issue. And then if they had a fill-in artist, I wouldn't buy that issue, and I didn't care how the story ended. And a lot of my collections, the runs I have in my collection are incomplete. So that's why I feel like I never really excelled as a writer. I just never knew how these stories ended up. I didn't really care. I just wanted to see the figures. I wanted to see the artwork. That's what really inspired me. And I never really got into why they inspired me. And I remember even just sort of guffawing or just going, really? That's why people read comics? Like, as I got older in college, you read like more academic explanations, like, oh, comic books appeal to kids because of the power of fantasy. As an adolescent, the X-Men are appealing because they're characters that are outsiders, and that's how estranged, teenagers feel, or that they, have taken the vow to protect humanity who hate them, and it's about prejudice, and that's why it's. And I'm like, no, this guy can shoot beams out of his eyes, and this guy he can create an ice sled, and they have these cool costumes, and they have these cool powers, and so for whatever strange reason, I couldn't connect that appreciation or study of literature and thematic elements of stories and apply that to comics. For whatever reason, comics were escapism and fun, and it was all about the colors, the costumes, the powers, and who was stronger. So maybe it was a power fantasy that appealed to me. I just didn't realize it, So, but definitely AJ later, yes, absolutely. Now I understand the impact that these stories have, and how important these characters can be to people that are looking for inspiration or aspirational figures, right? We don't have mythological figures like back in the day. In many ways, comic books have kind of taken over a large chunk of pop culture. And I see on a daily, or used to on a daily basis when I, be at conventions or out and about, the impact these characters can have on people, right? I always like to say Batman's just not a character; he's a lifestyle, and by that, you meet fans that have, their arms covered, the sleeve, tattoo sleeves of all their favorite characters, or lines of dialogue from their favorite stories, and they'll have their Batman themed, baby carriage with their kid, their toddler inside, and they would be like, I can't wait till he or she grows up so I can introduce them to my favorite Batman animated cartoons. And then this movie, I've got it all lined up. I used to travel quite a bit, and, I'd always be amazed when you see like a Batman t-shirt in the middle of nowhere, or comic books or toys, and how important, not even just the stories, but like even having a toy of a character and the kind of gameplay and immersive world that physical element can spark inside a child's imagination.
Yeah, it's awesome. I think it's really it's kind of equalizer in terms of like the messages that the comics bring.
Yeah.
When I saw comics, it was Frank Miller and Alex Ross when he did Kingdom Come. I think those figures inspired me, at least, to go into comics. Are there any like illustrators or artists, Asian American, you're excited for? I think Jen Bartel, does variant covers for you guys.
She's terrific. Yeah.
And is there sort of like any illustrators and artists sort of like her coming up?
Gosh, there are a ton of artists each and every day. It's interesting where they're coming in from. So I'll use an example of a young artist, Gabriel Piccolo. He's a Brazilian artist. He drew Raven for us and Beast Boy, and we found him through Instagram. He had a very strong, devoted following, but he had never drawn comic books before. He'd drawn the comic book characters, and that's how he was. I think at the time maybe had over 1 million followers at that point. I think he's surpassed 2 at this point. But he had a really fun, aesthetically pleasing style. We reached out to him. We were able to create a deal and bring him in and have him draw stories, right? So the ability to kind of get into this business is at probably an all-time high through the power of social media. And it's really exciting to see sort of the styles of the younger artists. I will say, though, that there are a lot of great Korean artists. And I've always kind of mused sometimes at panels, like if you were to do an Olympics of comic book artists, right? But like there's a Canadian team, an American team, a Korean team, a Brazilian team. The Korean team would be pretty stacked, right? Like, Jay Lee, Jin Ha, Mike Choi, Kim Jung-ji, amazing. That guy in himself, by himself, could carry the whole team. And Frank Cho is another one. So to be a comic book artist, and it's different today, but certainly for my generation, typically you're very nerdy, you're super geeky, but you're also, at least for me, having that feeling of being an outsider, and especially if you're trying to simulate and like look at people's behavior and their gestures and the way they dress and the way they talk and interact, I think it makes you more observant, right? And that level that's important if you're trying to draw social situations or stories or sort of visually show a person's turmoil or what they're thinking through the drawing itself. And so I do feel like that, at least for me, played a role. I'd be curious to hear from my peers. But for me, that was a big part of it.
I know we're almost out of time, but we have one last question, which is, do you think this country could ever embrace an Asian superhero? Yeah,
look, we have quite a few, but I think we could definitely have more, right? So at DC, Ryan Choi's The Atom, Cassandra Cain was Batgirl. Those are probably my 2 favorite. The company or the line of comics I created at Wildstorm, we had a character called Grunge, which was a lot of fun because he was kind of my anecdote to my upbringing. He was just like he was an Asian, male Asian teen, but he was not into academics. He was just like a slacker. This is the 90s, right? And it was kind of fun just doing different, taking stereotypes and kind of putting on flipping them on their head. But yeah, I think for sure, 100%. This is the era where representation and diversity are paramount. I do think we have a lot of catching up to do, though. And it's not just about the characters themselves. I think it's the people behind the camera, so to speak, right? The people that are writing and drawing the stories, but also the people that are hiring the people that are writing and drawing the stories, or the people that manage the people that are hiring, right? So all throughout the industry, I think there's this call for greater diversity and representation. But for me, growing up, I had no expectations of ever seeing Asian superheroes, because I grew up on Charlie Chan, played by a white person, in heavy makeup. And I'm thrilled and thrilled for my kids and their kids that things have changed and that they will have greater representation than ever, and with each succeeding generation. And so, I think the real trick to taking these characters that have been in print for a while is getting them the exposure through media, because that's something that's the big game changer, right? That's how you reach billions of people versus millions of people. And so I think that's, one of the challenges we have is like, how do we do this in an organic way that feels authentic and true to the canon, but, really kind of shows the diversity within our universe, and having that diversity mirror the real life diversity we see in our fandom and our readership and our fan base.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
We so appreciate your time and your candor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like I said, I was going to say, brought up a lot of pleasant memories, things I hadn't thought about in some time. But yeah, I think the great thing about this industry is that we're making everything up. So it literally is the power of the mind moving this this whole industry forward. And so I look forward to the challenges that we have, and really tapping into our amazing talent base and community, and creating sort of the next generation of heroes going forward.
Hello, this is AJ, closing out this season of K-Pod. A special thank you to Juliana and Catherine for having me on as a guest co-host, and a collective thank you to Jim Lee for being such an awesome guest on the podcast. You can follow him on Instagram and Twitter at Jim Lee. K-Pod is hosted by Juliana Sohn and Catherine Hong, brought to you by KoreanAmericanStory.org. Audio engineered by me, AJ Valente, and produced by Jessica Park, with HJ Lee as our executive producer. You can email us with comments and suggestions at kpod@KoreanAmericanStory.org or in the comments section below on YouTube. Follow us on Instagram at KPodPod. That's KPODPOD. And if you haven't already yet, subscribe to K-Pod and leave a nice review in AMP. We'll be back next year for Season 3 of K-Pod. Thanks for listening.